katoa. Aotearoa New Zealand produces more food than our population needs. So how can we have a food security problem? Well, if we assume that climate change is not going to get any worse, biodiversity collapse will reverse, or that geopolitical instability, conflict over dwindling resources and trade disruption are not going to be problems in the future, then perhaps we don't. Everything might be just fine. But these assumptions don't stand up in the face of the evidence. As we have already heard, all of these trajectories are set to worsen. We are now experiencing what one war can do to liquid fuel and fertiliser supplies. As climate change and energy and material descent progresses, and conflicts over increasingly contested resources such as oil, rare earth metals, fertiliser, water, and arable land intensify, we can expect more geopolitical conflict, not less. So let's take a stocktake of our national food system as it stands now. New Zealand produces meat, dairy products, fruit, and vegetables in volumes that far exceed domestic consumption. Currently, this surplus is exported. However, this net production surplus masks critical vulnerabilities. Staples such as wheat, rice, and sugar are not grown in sufficient quantity to meet domestic needs. In particular, domestic cereal production meets only a fraction of New Zealand grain consumption. Most domestic demand is met by imports. In addition, New Zealand currently does not produce enough non-animal proteins to satisfy demand. Aside from walnuts and macadamias, most nuts are imported. And in the case of legumes, another food high in protein, New Zealand grows peas and beans, but is wholly dependent on imports for legumes such as soybeans, chickpeas, lentils, and peanuts. The geographic source of some of these staple foods is limited in its diversity. For instance, most wheat for human consumption is imported from Australia. This makes these imported supplies highly vulnerable to crop failure or trade disruption. This matters because as climate change advances, the incidence of major crop failures is going to become more frequent. One journal study found that without the effects of climate change, a major corn harvest failure might happen every 16 years. At 2 degrees warming, which we are on the path for by 2050, such a crop failure is predicted to occur every 2 years. In some parts of Asia, it has become too hot to grow rice, and as sea level rise advances, rice fields are being affected by high salinity levels. Geopolitical conflict will also make supply chains, especially from markets farther afield, less certain. Our current system is geared towards producing a surplus in certain foods, especially animal products, while producing a deficit in others, such as cereals and non-animal proteins. This may work today when the rest of the world wants our surplus and we can get it to them at a reasonable cost, but is less suited to a world in which energy costs and geopolitical instability make it far less tenable to trade long distances. This is a snapshot of our food stocks and flows, but this doesn't get to the heart of the vulnerability of our food production system. The conclusion of a recent study is revealing. It found that under severe global shocks, such as a nuclear winter, the amount of food produced in New Zealand could exceed domestic dietary energy requirements if redistributed domestically. But, as the study recognised, this is based on the assumption that the current agricultural system continues to function. In other words, there is enough fuel, fertiliser, seeds, machinery and machinery parts to continue to produce at existing levels. If this capacity diminishes, the ability to produce food is likely to degrade, potentially severely. So let's have a closer look at these dependencies. While domestic food production volumes are generally high, New Zealand's agricultural system has critical risks. Our agricultural system is heavily dependent on imported liquid fuels, particularly diesel for tractors, harvesters, transport, and processing. Without fuel, not only would agricultural production be significantly diminished, but also the harvest, storage, processing, and distribution of food. We also rely heavily on fertiliser imports, especially urea. Most urea and other fertilisers, such as phosphate, are imported. As we are seeing with the conflict in the Middle East, supply is vulnerable to geopolitical and supply chain disruption. In addition, farm machinery, spare parts, agricultural chemicals such as pesticides and herbicides are also largely imported. In a disrupted global economy without these inputs, industrialised agriculture's mechanical base could degrade quickly, compromising our ability to produce enough food to feed our population. But even without global disruption, our industrialised, highly centralised food distribution system is extremely vulnerable to domestic disruption caused by extreme weather events or other natural disasters. At its root, this comes down to an economic system that values efficiency maximisation over resilience. In New Zealand, 2 major supermarket chains control about 90% of all food supply. Naturally, they want the supply and distribution system to be as efficient and therefore profitable as possible. This means the concentration of crops in certain areas, for example, onions in Pukekohe and broccoli in Horowhenua, for example. This works well when things are going well, but less well when the place is hit by a weather event or other natural disaster. Similarly, the centralisation of distribution to 3 main centres may be good for scale and efficiency while fuel costs are relatively low and roads are open, but has minimal resilience in times of disruption. Centralisation also creates perverse outcomes. Milk produced in Southland is transported hundreds of kilometres to a distribution centre in Christchurch before being transported back to a supermarket in Invercargill, for example. And it is important to remember that this efficiency only rings true from a narrow business perspective. For society, the environment, and the climate, this system is both highly inefficient and harmful. Because it involves much greater transportation distances, a centralised distribution system uses much more energy and emits much more air and greenhouse gas pollution than a localised distribution system. Similarly, it takes much more energy, water, land, and produces a lot more pollution to produce a calorie from animal farming compared to plant-based foods such as legumes. These inefficiencies are externalised and paid for by society and the biosphere in the form of water pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate heating. Of course, too, an industrialised animal protein-oriented agricultural system has major animal welfare implications. The cruelty of farrowing crates for pigs and their babies and live cattle exports are the extremes that attract attention. But the separation and slaughtering of days-old calves to generate milk, high-density containment of broiler chickens, heat and other forms of stress suffered by animals such as during transportation are just examples of everyday farming practices. And our current food system also produces a huge amount of waste. While we do not have comprehensive figures for New Zealand, we know that globally, about 30% of all food is wasted. 30%. About 13% is lost between harvest and retail, and an estimated 17% is wasted in households. This means that up to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from food that is never eaten. Finally, despite overall abundance at a national level, many households in New Zealand experience food insecurity due to affordability and access issues. This disproportionately affects Māori and Pacifica families. We know that 1 in 5 children regularly experience food insecurity. They don't have enough to eat. Furthermore, food deserts, where lower socio-economic communities are deliberately targeted by fast food outlets, is a major issue in New Zealand. So what is the pathway to a more resilient, food-secure future? I believe we must follow the lead of the United Kingdom and many other countries and develop a national food strategy informed by a comprehensive national food security assessment. It is likely that such an assessment will point to the need to recalibrate land use to better balance domestic food consumption requirements against the production of export commodities, especially as the future viability of these products looks increasingly uncertain. Animal agriculture currently occupies 90% of New Zealand's productive land. Any clear-eyed assessment will signal the need to shift away from highly energy and resource-intensive livestock production towards crops such as wheat, rice, legumes and nuts, for which we rely heavily on imports. This would not only reduce the greenhouse gas, resource, water and land footprint of food production, it would also lead to a much healthier population, relieving pressure on our public health system. Because these crops make fewer demands on land, this would create opportunities to free up marginally productive land and return it to nature, with all the biodiversity, resilience and carbon sequestering benefits that will bring. At the same time, we must step up the protection of New Zealand's precious, highly productive soils, just 15% of land area on which food crops are grown. Too much of this soil has been lost to urban sprawl in recent decades. Diversification of food production systems, including where crops are produced, how they're processed, distributed and sold, will create much more resilience in the food system and make it less energy and greenhouse gas intensive. At the same time, revitalising local economies. In addition, we can put in place policies that support iwi and hapu-led food sovereignty initiatives, home gardening and urban food production. Finally, we must reduce food waste at every step of the process from farm to plate. Food security is one sphere in which the solutions are both clear and entirely viable. And not only will they create resilience in our food system, but they will also bring immediate co-benefits in terms of human health, local economic vitality, animal welfare, biodiversity, and environmental protection. But it will take civil society to make this happen. Many of us are working to make our own families and communities more food resilient, but to strengthen national food security, we must change the system. We must make politicians aware of what is at stake and what gains can be made by acting on national food security. Thank you.